Recently, I've been using the polling tool on the community tab, and for 2020, I did a video summarizing all of the polls from that year and giving my thoughts on the results. Now I'm going to do the same thing for 2021, so we can go over that year's polls and talk about those results. I tried to post a new poll at the beginning of every month, and whether you're a subscriber or not, you can respond to the poll and give your opinion on whatever I happen to be asking about. So, on January 1st, I wanted to celebrate the new year by asking what kinds of new biological things do people want to see discovered or developed the most in 2021, and the results were pretty uplifting. A plurality of voters, about a third of the total voter vote count, chose green technologies and eco-friendly infrastructure, which is great because these are things that we're going to desperately need to develop if we want our civilization to be able to survive the changing climate and perhaps mitigate the worst of the potential consequences. Now, following that was kind of a neck-and-neck tie between new medicines and biotechnologies and better funding for research and education. By the time I'm recording this video, better funding for research and education actually edged out new medicines and biotechnologies. And what that tells me is that people are recognizing the importance of new medicines and biotechnologies, especially going into the 21st century, but people are also realizing that perhaps a more pressing problem is funding for this research and for education, to be able to educate the next generation of researchers to carry on this civilization-spanning, multi-generational scientific project. To my surprise, the discovery of new plants and animal species was actually the least popular option. And this was also kind of counterintuitive to me, as I always assumed that the discovery of new species, whether they're fossils or living organisms hidden away in some remote corner of the earth, I always figured that kind of stuff was super fascinating to people. After all, in a poll I did last year, I asked what your favorite type of news segment was, and the most popular answers were about fossils, new species, and evolutionary history. Perhaps when we also take into consideration stuff like climate change and healthcare, the discovery of new species kind of takes a back seat on our priority list, and I can understand that. Okay, so let's go to the next month. In February, in celebration of Valentine's Day, I asked what kind of animal has the weirdest mating strategy. The options available to choose from were snails, because of their weird pseudo-combative hermaphroditic sex strategies, the praying mantis, which eats her mate after sex, the seahorse, where the male gestates the offspring, the hyenas, which are well known for their larger, more sexually aggressive females with phallic clitoral physiology, and whales, which are the biggest animals on the planet, with the correspondingly biggest genitals as well. To my surprise, the answers to this poll were pretty narrowly focused on just a few answers. No one chose the whales, and only a few people chose seahorses. A few more people chose hyenas, a few more people than them, about a quarter of the total, chose praying mantises, but almost half of people chose snails. And I totally get it. I mean, all the other options are weird in their own way, but the snails are just weirder than weird. They're hermaphrodites, which is already unusual because none of the other options were hermaphrodites. They're all basic male, female, all of the animals in these other options, they all reproduce through basic male-female sexual replication. They don't have that hermaphroditic dynamic that the snails have. And in addition to this, the snails have super weird genitals, definitely way weirder than hyenas or whales or anything else. Their combined penis-vagina organ can be turned inside out, extruding from a genital pore in a way that looks kind of like a weird slime mold. And they use their inverted genitals to caress each other, and to stab each other with love darts, to cover each other with slime that's heavy and volatile with odors, and to impregnate each other. It's just all around really mega weird, and it totally makes sense why they dominated this month's poll. Moving on to the next month, for March, I asked, what's your favorite type of fish? Colorful schoolfish that you'd see around a reef ecosystem, predators like sharks, record-breaking fish like swordfish and sunfish, creepy fish like what you'd find lurking in the darkest depths or the most rugged reefs, and a final option for people who don't really have a favorite fish, so long as they taste good. Well, the results of the poll were pleasantly surprising. No one chose the last option, which is kind of neat because it means that people are actually interested in the creatures themselves, and they aren't turned off by their slick, scaly, fish-eyed morphology. Also, to my pleasant surprise, The small, colorful fish in schools and reefs was the most popular option, followed by the creepy weirdos like eels and anglerfish. And to be honest, I was expecting record breakers like swordfish and predators like sharks to be way more popular than they actually ended up being, but alas, they were a small and very small minority of the vote, respectively. For April, I asked what kind of life you think might exist in Europa's oceans. The options start big and then decrease in complexity. So to begin, we had big animals and complex ecosystems, and then small animals and slightly less complex ecosystems, and then diverse microbial communities, and then not very diverse microbial communities that were very environmentally limited, very, tightly focused or specific niches. And then the last option was for people who thought that there was no life at all in Europa's oceans. I was a bit surprised at how many people chose the no life in Europa's oceans option. But then again, I'm kind of optimistic to the point of being a tad unreasonable about alien life in the moons of the outer solar system. I really want it to be the case, but let's be real here, it probably isn't. I was, however, happy to see that most people think that Europa's oceans have lots of big, complex life forms, which would certainly be super cool, and would pretty much be the most incredible outcome from a scientific perspective. But unfortunately, when we take all the variables into consideration, I really doubt that Europa could, in reality, actually support this level of complexity. Roughly similar numbers of people chose among the intermediate options, with slightly more people selecting the fourth option, which is definitely a strong possibility. Roughly similar numbers of people chose among the intermediate options. And the fourth possibility here, non-diverse microbial communities limited to deep-sea hydro vents, this is perhaps the most realistic possibility. Non-diverse microbial communities limited to geological features like deep-sea hydrothermal vents, that I think is the most likely case for life in the oceans of Europa. The 1 out of 8 people who chose widespread diverse microbial communities, but no bigger creatures, also realistic, maybe a little bit less so because that would suggest that these microbial communities were able to spread out and adapt to all these different environments, and that's just adding another layer of evolutionary complexity, making it that much more unlikely from a theoretical mathematical perspective. Now, despite what I think is the most plausible series of options, they didn't have that many votes because, let's be honest, they're not very exciting. Definitely the most popular option is the most exciting option, that Europa's oceans are like straight out of Europa report, full of complex animals, a complex food web, big alien octopus creatures, all that stuff. I want it to be true, I just don't think it is. Anyway, let's go to May. So for the month of May, I returned to kind of a funsy question. I asked, in general, what's your favorite type of amphibian? Smaller frogs like tree frogs, bigger frogs like warty toads, the elongated, sort of lizard-shaped newts and salamanders, the snake-like Sicilians, and the fifth option was for people who thought amphibians were slimy and gross. Now, unlike the fish question, someone actually did choose this final option. And I get it, they're slimy, some people may not like that. I personally think that frogs and salamanders and stuff are really adorable, in addition to being extremely ecologically valuable creatures. But the slime grosses people out, I understand. And what was cool though was that in a pretty diverse field, in a pretty even spread, honestly, the prowling lizard-like newts and salamanders took the lead with a little more than a quarter of the vote. And that's understandable because newts and salamanders are awesome. The votes were relatively evenly spread compared to some other polls I've done. There was a clear winner. To my great surprise, the snake-like Sicilians were actually the most popular, with about 1 in 3 of the votes. Following behind in a close second place was the newts and salamanders, and that makes sense because newts and salamanders are frickin' awesome. I'm really surprised and kind of confused how the Sicilians were able to edge them out. And the frogs, I thought everybody loved frogs, but the smaller frogs, like dart frogs and tree frogs, the really brightly colored, cool-looking ones, only 1 in 5 voters chose that option, and even fewer chose big warty toads. I guess together that's a combined 36%, which would put them frogs in the number 1 position, but interesting nonetheless. The results for the May poll definitely surprised me. The poll question for the month of June was based on some contemporary news stories. It was around this time in 2021 that the lab leak hypothesis for the origin of COVID was beginning to gain more traction, and topics like lab protocol and safety standards, as well as research motives and potential bioweapons, were all being discussed on mainstream news. So I asked, what, in your opinion, is the scariest pandemic paradigm? In other words, what kind of situational context for a pathogen outbreak would be the most dreadful and terrifying? The options were a pathogen that contaminates our food or water, a pathogen in an animal or a plant that can mutate into a human invasive form, a drug-resistant bacteria or some other microbe that we can't effectively treat, climate change causing some areas to warm up and allowing tropical diseases to spread into new areas and infect new populations who may have little to no resistance, and a man-made bioweapon, presumably taking the form of a bioengineered pathogenic microbe. The results of this poll were pretty interesting. There were 3 options that were widely popular, and 2 options that were not nearly as popular. Of the unpopular ones, diseases spreading to a new area, like because of climate change, climate warming, got 0% of the votes. No votes. And that's honestly kind of surprising and a bit disappointing, because that is a very realistic threat that's going to affect people more and more in the coming century. I mean, we're already seeing it in North America with Lyme disease, which is moving farther and farther north as the overall climate gets warmer. And the other relatively unpopular choice was novel animal or plant diseases adapting to human hosts. And this was also relatively surprising considering these contemporary news stories, because one of the prevailing theory of the origin of COVID is that it came from a wet market, like a meat market. So it came from some kind of animal and then mutated into a more human invasive form. And we all know how scary and destructive COVID is. Well, I mean, if we're paying attention and taking it seriously, but not everyone is. And then, among the 3 most popular options, non-human diseases that contaminate our foodstuff or water was at about 27% of the vote. And that's a really scary outcome. Diseases don't have to affect us specifically to be scary. If all of our if our crops die, we're not facing death by disease, we're facing death by starvation and civilizational collapse. And that's arguably a whole lot scarier. Another of the more popular options was drug-resistant bacteria that are hard or impossible to treat. And this is legit scary, and it's also very real. And then finally, a bioweapon, a man-made biological weapon, was chosen as the most scary situation. And I gotta agree with that. This is what I would have voted for too, because I'm pretty certain that governments around the world have all kinds of bioweapon stocks, from weaponized pathogens and insects like mosquitoes to anti-biological chemical agents like Agent Orange. Perhaps the scariest part about a man-made bioweapon is that that experts somewhere have been tinkering with it and designing it to intentionally be as insidiously destructive as possible. Whether that means it has a really long incubation period and then pops up out of nowhere and causes devastating effects, that way it can spread faster and spread wider, or whether it's just causes a lot of pain and it's more of a psychological thing or meant to clog up hospital systems and logistics. That's also possible. The very idea that people would do this, and that if you were infected with it, you'd realize that you were a victim of this ultra creepy, biological warfare of these 2 superorganisms, these 2 collectives of human beings fighting each other for economic or territorial or whatever reasons. Just mad scary and creepy and disgusting. Okay, let's move on. Let's go to something a little bit happier. Let's go to the July poll. So for this month's poll, I asked, in a broad sense, what's your favorite reptile? The smaller creatures like geckos, larger creatures like crocodiles and Gila monsters, the snakes and the various serpents that slither on the ground, the tough turtles and tortoises, and of course the final option was for people who didn't really like reptiles and thought they were smelly and scary or otherwise unpleasant. To my happy surprise, the results formed an almost perfectly normal distribution curve. The most popular option, capturing a strong plurality of about 43% of the vote, were the snakes and serpents. And I can see this, as the snakes are charismatic and unique, and they're definitely badass. I had the very distinct pleasure of having a snake try to attack me once. And it was super wild and scary, even though the snake was safely confined behind a pane of glass. Now, in the sloping sections of the bell curve to either side, the turtles and tortoises came in strong at about 29%, and that's honestly a lot better than I thought they'd do. And the option for larger beasts like crocodiles and Gila monsters came in at 19%, about 1 in 5 voters, and that's a lot lower than I thought they'd do. The crocodiles and the Gila monsters and all these other super large predatory reptiles, these are my favorite types of reptiles, because they're veritable real-life monsters. But only 1 in 5 people agree. How odd. Anyway, at the tail end of the bell curve, we see that smaller critters like geckos and iguana captured a meager 5% of the vote. And that's also a bit lower than I thought it would be. Because, they're cute, and they're really cool looking. They come in all sorts of different colors, and they live in the trees, they live on the ground. How can you not love them? And lastly, another 5% of respondents chose the dislike option, declaring that no reptiles are cool, as they are smelly and scary. Now, reptiles can be scary, that's definitely true, but they can also be really cool looking, and even adorable. But in my experience, pretty much all reptiles smell terrible, so that much is accurate. For the August poll, I asked a rather fun question. If we could genetically recreate dinosaurs like they did in Jurassic Park, what kind of dinosaurs would you want to see recreated first? It's hard to generalize the dinosaurs down into 5 broad groups, because they're so diverse, but the options that I came up with were the enormous long-necked sauropods, giant, terrifying carnivorous theropods, smaller, also scary carnivorous theropods, large herbivorous sauropods, and huge armored thyreophora. Now, this poll had a pretty interesting result. There was 2 really popular answers, and then 3 lesser answers that picked up the rest pretty evenly. And all of the options were pretty well represented, all things considered. It's definitely not a nice clean distribution curve like last month's poll results were. This poll is also an example of my favorite outcome for a poll, because it shows a genuine diversity of preference and opinion in the audience. And that's always more fascinating to me than lopsided results where 1 or 2 answers take almost all the votes. So the small theropods, like velociraptors, got about 15% of the vote, and the large theropods, like the tyrannosaurs, got about 12% of the vote, which means that a combined 27% of people want us to immediately recreate Mesozoic death machines for our entertainment. It's kinda like you people watched Jurassic Park and then paused it halfway through, assumed it all turns out well, and then returned the VHS tape to Blockbuster without rewinding it, so you never saw the film again. Because you must have missed it, I feel the need to inform you that the main takeaway from Jurassic Park was that we probably shouldn't do that. It's a bad idea. People are gonna die. Another 15% of people voted for the sauropods, like Triceratops, and that kind of surprised me because I thought they'd be a lot more popular than they were. And conversely, I was surprised to see that Thyreophora, the stegosaurs and ankylosaurs and other armored dinosaurs, got a strong 23% of the vote. So that surprised me as well. That's more than I expected. And then taking it home with 35% of the vote, we have perhaps the most elegant and noble of the dinosaurs, the long-necked sauropods. I agree probably the most with these people, as these I think would be the perfect dinosaurs to recreate for our real-life Jurassic Park. Herbivorous, slow, ponderous, beautiful, that's how you make it work. So take notes, Hammond. For the September poll, I asked, what's your favorite type of bird? Again, there's an extreme diversity of birds, so it was really difficult narrowing it down to 5 options, but I tried my best. So these options were colorful tropical birds, predatory birds, big, tall, long-legged birds, high-performance birds, and a negative option for people who don't think that birds are very interesting. Happily, only 4% of people chose the dislike option, and that's pretty good because birds are awesome and totally underrated. But almost no one, just another 4%, liked the big, tall-legged bird option, and that surprised me because, birds like ostriches and cranes and storks, they're beautiful animals. Cranes and storks can fly really impressive distances. Ostriches are just hardcore and super badass monster birds. I freaking love them. Anything that can completely disembowel me with a kick of the foot and a flick of the toe, I respect. Approximately a third of respondents voted for one of the two exotic bird options, including the colorful tropical birds like toucans and quetzals at 17%, and the high-performance birds like albatrosses and hummingbirds at 13%. I was honestly a bit frustrated with these options because they're so broad, and they include such a diverse range of birds that it's kind of weird to say that this whole group is your favorite. I mean, maybe some are, maybe you don't care as much about others. Maybe you think hummingbirds are cool, but you don't give a hoot about albatrosses. That's the problem with birds, is they're just so absurdly diverse. They defy easy categorization and simple polls from biologic podcasters. Now, by far and away, the most popular option at 61% were the predatory birds, like the eagles, owls, the hawks, and others. Again, this is an overly broad category that includes a lot of birds, but I kind of suspected that this would be the most popular option because predatory birds, the raptors and stuff, are just super, super cool. They're the epitome of fierce intelligence, of visually spectacular hunters, and perhaps for these reasons and others, they get incorporated into military and political insignia and symbology across the planet. For the October poll, I asked about your vaccination status, with 4 options: fully vaccinated, partially vaccinated, unvaccinated due to medical issues, and unvaccinated due to personal choice. Thankfully, more than 3/4 of respondents, more than 80%, said that they were fully vaccinated. And that's awesome. Really, guys, it's great. You are doing your part to help protect yourself and everyone around you, your community, from getting COVID infections or from getting serious COVID infections. You're helping us all get one person closer to achieving functional herd immunity. And you're also greatly reducing your chances of ending up in the hospital if you do get infected. And that's important too, because anything we can do to reduce the strain and the pressure on the hospital system, that's critically important at this point in the pandemic. Now, another 12% of people said that they're in the process of getting their full vaccine. They're partially vaccinated, but they're still trying to get their second shot or booster. And this is also awesome because it means they're trying and they're getting it done. So that's approximately 93% of respondents reporting some kind of positive vaccination status. That's awesome. The reason we do this, why everyone needs to get vaccinated, is to protect the 4% of us, or at least the 4% of respondents to this poll, who can't get vaccinated because of a medical issue, like a compromised immune system. These people are at a particularly high risk of infection, and they need to rely on the secondary protection of a sufficiently vaccinated community to protect them from exposure to the virus. And lastly, we have 4% of people who are unvaccinated because of personal reasons. Frankly, there is no good explanation or defense for this behavior. It's openly juvenile, selfish, and destructive. You'd think that the parade of right-wing anti-vax politicians, radio hosts, and religious leaders who are all dying in the droves of COVID would change some minds. You would think that the overwhelming majority of hospitalizations and COVID deaths being among the unvaccinated would change some minds. You would think that base animal-level self-preservation would kick in at some point and change some minds. But nope, you'd be wrong. And that's why this pandemic is still going strong almost 2 years later. For the November poll, I asked about your favorite type of mammal. And much like the birds, there's so much diversity here that it's really hard to include it all. I personally love elephants, but they're in their own weird little clade near the base of the mammal family tree, and I ran out of options to fit them in. But the options I did make were rodents and rabbits and other small fuzzy herbivores, ungulates like horses, giraffes, hippos, marine mammals like cetaceans, whales and dolphins, as well as seals and walruses, carnivorous mammals like tigers, bears, lynx, and lions, as well as all the rest, and primates of all kinds, from monkeys to great apes. Again, there was too many different types of mammals, so I didn't have room for a dislike option. Besides, who dislikes mammals? Some of the best animals are mammals. I mean, hell, some of the best people that I know are mammals. And much like the other poll where I said it was cool how widespread the results were, the same is true here. The votes were spread pretty equally between all of the options. Marine animals, carnivorous animals, and primates all got about 1/5 of the vote, about 20%, while the ungulates got a bit less at 1/6 of the vote, and the rodents eked out a win at about 1/4 of the vote. And honestly, these results really surprised me. I didn't expect rodents and rabbits to be that popular. I thought they'd be the least popular. I expected primates and either marine or carnivorous mammals to be really popular, and the ungulates to be somewhere in between, but I was wrong on all counts. I kinda like it when this happens, you know? I like it when the poll results are a fun surprise, when it's something you didn't expect. And lastly, for the December poll, I asked a question about theoretical alien microbes. In your opinion, which situation is the most likely? Aerosolized microbes in the clouds of Venus, methanogenic microbes in the regolith of Mars, Earth microbes that have been blasted off and landed on the moon and they've become adapted to the moon, microbes in the subsurface oceans of Enceladus or Europa, and exotic alien microbes from out of our solar system brought to us by an interstellar meteor. This question is super fun, and I was really excited to see what you guys thought. I had some suspicions of how it might turn out, but at the end of the day, I really didn't know quite what to expect with this. To my surprise, the Mars and Venus options were the least popular, each coming away with just 12% of the vote. I was expecting both of them, especially the Mars option, to be much more popular. Microbes in the oceans of moons in the outer system were a bit more popular at 18%, and the idea of exotic alien microbes from another star system, brought to us via panspermia on the back of a meteor, got 25% of the vote, so 1 in 4, that's pretty good. And this is a lot more like what I expected, as both of these options are particularly weird and cool and sufficiently alien for us to really let our imaginations go wild. And the most popular option was for Earth microbes that have adapted to the moon, 35%. Now this is a very plausible and realistic scenario, relatively speaking, compared to everything else. But it's so much less colorful and exciting than genuine alien microbes on some other planet or from another star system. But, I can't fault the voters for being realistic. And the question was, what do you think is the most likely outcome in our solar system? So as much as I think that it's kind of the lamest of all the available options, I gotta agree with the 35% of voters that this is definitely the most likely option. Alright, so there you go. Those were the polls from 2021. I like doing these polls. It's a fun little avenue for community engagement, but unfortunately I've noticed that there isn't a whole lot of engagement. Most polls only get, between 15 and 25 responders, and usually 0 comments. So it doesn't seem like a particularly popular little forum or avenue for community engagement. So what I think I'll do is I'll still do polling from time to time, but I might make it more event-focused, rather than periodical and asking about, a random topic. So if you've been enjoying the more event-focused polls, then there you go. I'm going to start doing that predominantly now, going on into the future. Anyways, thanks for listening, and have a great year.